There's an article recently in the New York Times about a teenager who committed suicide after having engaged in very lengthy conversations with a chatbot on character.ai. This raises the general question about what's the role or what ought to be the role of AI in terms of our relationships. Should we have relationships with robots, essentially? Should we have them with chatbots? Or is it harmful or unethical or contrary to a flourishing life or something along those lines? Today I'm talking to Robert Mahari. He is a joint JD PhD degree candidate at Harvard Law School and the MIT Media Lab. He wrote an article recently at MIT Tech Review, co-authored with, I'm going to get this wrong, I'm sorry, Pat Padarantaporn. The title of that article, quote, "We need to prepare for addictive intelligence." In that article and in the conversation that I have with Robert, he draws out three kinds of issues. I'm not totally convinced that he's right, but I think that these are very interesting, worthwhile claims to investigate. And for what it's worth, at the end of the day, Robert agrees, I think, that we need more research. In fact, I know that he thinks we need more research. I just want to highlight the three main claims that he makes, the three main arguments that he makes about why AI companion harms, as he calls them, are a unique kind of harms that we really need to research and potentially regulate against. Number one, he thinks that when people engage in these relationships with chatbots, especially if you're a child or younger, 13, 14, 15, that it will actually undermine your capacity to connect to other real people. So the idea is having deep connections with other people is part of a meaningful, valuable, flourishing, good life. To the extent that relationships with AI chatbots undermine your capacity for that, it's a harm. It's undermining your ability to create those relationships that are an essential part of a good life. Okay, that's claim number one. Claim number two is that it's an affront to human dignity to spend so much time talking to an AI, or more specifically, that the way in which these AIs are created leads to over-reliance, leads to addiction, that it might subvert people's, feel like, free will or something along those lines, because it's people continuously coming back to engage in this relationship with this chatbot, even though it's harmful to them. That's the second claim that he makes. And then the third claim is that it's an affront to human dignity because essentially you're engaging with something that's not real. So we talk a little bit about a famous thought experiment by philosopher Robert Nozick called the experience machine. For those of you who don't know, the experience machine thought experiment is essentially, hey, listen, suppose that you could go into a machine, you'd enter a dreamlike state, and you can live the rest of your life out in that dreamlike state where it's already programmed that you're going to meet people and fall in love and have friends and success in a career and you win the Nobel Prize, whatever it is. Would you go into that machine? Or put slightly differently, would going into that machine be conducive to or undermining of you living a good life? The idea is supposed to be, Nozick's idea is supposed to be, it'd be undermining to leading a good life because your real life is you just sitting in a quasi-vegetative state on a table while you're strapped into this sort of virtual reality machine, and that sort of, you forget about that sort of thing, and then that is bad for you. That's the claim. And Robert thinks that there's something analogous going on with relationships with chatbots, and so it's an affront to human dignity. So again, those are the three claims. At the end of the day, though, to repeat, Robert thinks we need more research on this stuff, that the kinds of actual or potential harms that could come from interacting with a chatbot needs investigation. And at the end, we talk a little bit more about perhaps what the responsibilities are of the people who develop these chatbots. And we also talk about the potential for regulation. What would that look like? Do we need a regulation here? So that's all part of the discussion. Okay, that's what we're talking about today. I am your host, Reed Blackman. The name of this podcast, if you haven't realized it yet, Ethical Machines. If you've got advice about who you think or suggestions, who you think should come onto the show, suggestions about what you'd want me to talk about, then email me, em@reedblackman.com, em@reedblackman.com. And that's it. Let's go talk to Robert. So, Robert, from what I understand, you're particularly interested in relationships that people have with AI, and you think that they cause various kinds of harm, and in some cases, those harms ought to be regulated against. So I suppose my first question to you is, why do you hate love so much?
What a place to start. I don't hate love, nor do I want people to be lonely. I think oftentimes the kind of AI companionship technology is motivated by a desire to cure loneliness.
Yeah.
And so I'm not opposed to that at all. And in fact, I think, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, in a little moment, there's a tremendous amount of good that can come out of this, right? Both in terms
Mm,
of just a fun kind of new medium that people will enjoy, and maybe actually something that can help certain folks who are experiencing loneliness. The worry is that there can be over reliance, like with kind of anything, there's too much of a good thing. And specifically, something that concerns me is this idea of digital attachment disorder, where
digital attachment disorder? It already has a.
yeah, we love to coin
Did you make
things.
it up? Did you make up the
As far
name?
as I know, I coined it. That's right.
Okay, yeah.
So the concern there is the following. Every relationship that we have has, at a fundamental level, a giving and a taking. Like when you're with other people, even people who love you very much, like your parents, you have to reciprocate that love in some way. Otherwise, the relationship is going to break down. And so as humans, we train ourselves all the time to be responsive to our companions and our friends and our lovers' needs and to give as well as take. The interesting thing with AI is suddenly we have a form of companionship that is increasingly hard to distinguish from kind of human companionship. It's still limited to screens, but other than that, it's really quite similar to talking to a person, only that there's absolutely no expectation that you reciprocate in any way, shape, or form. And that's fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, only that the worry is that if you spend enough time in that kind of context, especially if you're coming from a place where you're already detached from other people, you might have a harder and harder time actually relating to regular people, become withdrawn, become even more lonely, even more
Mm,
reliant on this kind of AI crutch. Yeah, that's the worry.
I see. Some people might think something like, yeah, relationships with AIs or directing love or attention or something along those lines towards an AI is itself morally problematic. But that's not your view. Your view is, it reminds me of Kant's view about why you shouldn't be mean to animals. And Kant's view about why you shouldn't be mean or cruel to animals is not because they have any dignity or worth or something along those lines, but because if you treat animals poorly, non-human animals poorly, that will lead you to treat other people poorly. And so that's what's wrong with it. And so is your line similar? There's nothing wrong with having relationships with AIs as such. It's wrong, or rather, the problematic aspect of it is that it will cause people to be shitty in relationships more generally with other actual people.
Yeah, so I don't typically describe myself as a Kantian. And so it's an
No,
interesting,
I think
yeah.
he's wrong about the animal thing.
So I feel like the worry is less about how your behavior then affects other people and more about how your behavior affects your ability to have relationships, right? So the
Okay.
worry is the harm to the user, not so much the kind of second order harms to society, which may be there as well. But in the first instance, it's a worry about the individual who's in that relationship. Certainly not a worry about the AI.
Okay, let me push on this a little bit. Because that might be the case, right? So if I say, all right, I'll give you that it causes some harm and that it makes it to some degree more difficult for that person to form relationships with people or something along those lines, there's a number of things one might say in response. Number one is that, yeah, it causes that harm, but it's worth it because the kind of emotional connection that people get from it, maybe you find it weird or something, or someone finds it weird or odd or something along those lines. But as long as it's not intrinsically morally problematic, you haven't pushed that line and I haven't pushed that line. It could be the case that, yeah, it does a little bit of harm, but it also does some good. I eat junk food. It does me some health harm, but I still love it. The fact that it does some harm doesn't mean that you ought not to engage in it. I suppose that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is, what reason do we have for thinking that it really does cause that harm? It seems plausible. I wonder, though, if there's a correlation versus causation problem. It might be the case that this person started interacting with a chatbot. They don't have an ability to engage in relationships with people now, but I wonder if that would explain their going to the chatbot to begin with. Is itself because they couldn't engage in relationships with people? There's an underlying psychological cause having to do with the person having, I don't know, whatever, attachment issues with people, intimacy issues, or whatever it is, and that's what caused the flight to the chatbot? Yeah, so let's deal with those two objections first. What do you think of those?
Yes, we ought to discuss. There was a specific case involving a 14-year-old boy named Sewell. It was interesting. Like I have written about this topic over the summer, thinking this was a
This was the case of the New York Times, right?
exactly, yeah.
Pretty recently.
So I had written about this topic in the summer, thinking that it was something we should take seriously, but not expecting that there would be an actual case anytime soon. And only a few short months later, we find out that there was a teenage boy who did form a very close relationship to an AI companion and ended up taking his own life. And by all accounts, as far as I can tell, Sewell was fairly healthy, was doing well, had friendships, was on the basketball team. And it does seem like there was some element of causation there where the AI companionship ended up having him withdraw from other human relationships, feeling more lonely. And in the abstract, right? So there's this one particular case and it's going to make its way through the courts. But in the abstract, it will always be challenging to know what is causing the ultimate harm, right? And certainly some people are going to be more vulnerable to this, especially children, but lonely adults, the elderly, like you can imagine all sorts of vulnerable populations, who also might be predisposed to, say, self-harm or social isolation. That's exactly why they're seeking out these companionships, right? The worry is, in a way, pouring fuel on the fire, right? That you suddenly have a technology that makes some of these predispositions worse. And especially that doesn't really help people fix anything or feel better, but rather withdraw further from reality and from other human relationships. And we very much saw that in Sewell's case, where there was several conversations that involved suicidal ideation. And instead of referring him to an expert or ending the interaction or anything like that, it wasn't that the companion was explicitly encouraging him to take his life, but there certainly wasn't any discouragement. And there were these elements of come to my world, we can be happy together, I love you so much, that maybe in his mind felt like nudges, whether he was conscious of that or to ultimately take his life.
All right, so let's talk about that case. I don't want to get too into the weeds of it because my reading of it was actually not the same as yours. You may have read more of it. I only read the Times article. I didn't do any more sort of digging about the case other than that. There were examples in the Times case where the chatbot said, no, don't kill yourself. I'd have to kill myself. I did kill myself. That would be terrible. So it looked like there were cases in which the chatbot was saying, that's horrendous. Don't do that. Never say that again. Don't think that stuff. Then it seemed to be other kinds of things, you're right, where it said join me, but also it looked like it might have been confused about what joining me would amount to. It might not have read the metaphor of joining me as death. So anyway, I don't want to get too into the weeds of that case. So there's two threads that I want to pull on here. One is that it serves as a kind of escape, and so it's providing a kind of harm. And the other is there wasn't an intervention either by the chatbot itself, or that say you need to go to contact an expert, or the company who owns the chatbot. Who's the company?
So it's
again? Do you
Character
remember?
AI.
Right, Character AI, yeah. Let's talk about the escape thing first. Suppose I say, yeah, I'll grant you this kid had some issues. He did have some issues prior to engaging with the chatbot, if I recall correctly. But at any rate, let's just say he goes to the chatbot and he gets immersed in the chatbot or talking with the chatbot. And we should say that this was not at least primarily a sexual or romantic interaction. They had some sort of romantic back and forth, but that was clearly not the primary function of this chatbot for the boy. And suppose I say, look, Robert, lots of things are escapes. I played a ton of Nintendo when I was a kid. I also read a lot of books when I was a kid, and still. But you could say he withdrew from society. He used to have friends, but he found himself so-and-so increasingly played these video games or increasingly read books where he could imagine himself the hero or blah, 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 blah. So I suppose I could say something like, here's a principle. If X is the kind of thing to which someone could flee in moments of distress on a pretty regular basis because it's so available, then there's something problematic about X or harmful about X, or we need to really beware of X. And either that's false because of examples like TV and books and video games, or even sport for that matter, or it's true, but it doesn't make AI to be anything in particular or chatbots to be particularly significant in that arena, such that it deserves special attention as compared to all the other things I mentioned.
Yeah, so on the first kind of point you mentioned about whether there were pre-existing issues in this particular case, Sewell had been diagnosed with a mild case of Asperger's as a child, but it didn't seem like he had any serious kind of behavioral or mental problems before it appears until he started engaging with the Character AI companion. But more generally, right? And I realize, right, there's something we can learn from a particular case, but it only goes so far. So more generally, in terms of this idea of escapism, look, like, certainly there are social media addictions and gaming addictions, and I think that these can serve as good examples for how we ought to proceed. And especially in the case of social media, I personally think we did a really terrible job of finding ways to get the best out of those technologies while limiting the harms. What's different, I would argue, about AI companionship, though, is that it is the direct replacement for human contact, right? Video games or novels or sports or all of those things are distractions and can help offer an escape from reality. But ultimately, they don't replace the feelings and the context of being with another person. Whereas here we have a medium that kind of directly targets that type of interaction. And it can be really sophisticated where you can have friends, you can have lovers, you can have parents, you can have mentors, you can have therapists, you can have all these different characters that replace kind of certain functions of other human beings. And I think that maybe it's a paradigm shift, but maybe it's just incrementally more likely to result in overuse. And it's not that this is completely new. I would argue that we've never had this before, right? We've never had a entertainment medium that, effortlessly passes the Turing test. That is an interesting kind of new paradigm we're in. But even if you feel like, okay, there's nothing new here, this is the same as social media and gaming, I would say, okay, that's fair enough, but those things are pretty addictive and people develop bad habits. And this has the potential to be even more. So think we ought to take it seriously.
I guess I want to hear a little bit more about the addictive nature of this, as opposed to very enjoyable, feels good, I don't know, maybe even meaningful. Some people will attest to its being really meaningful interactions. Kids present a special case. I think that I want to, there's some extent to which I think we need to separate out how we feel or what we think about these situations with regards to children having a relationship with the chatbots and adults having a relationship with chatbots. So is the addiction thing, actually I think, why not just let go of the addiction claim? Say it's not addiction, it's just something to which people are drawn to and they engage in a lot. And to the extent that they engage in it a lot, it causes sort of psychological harm in the form of inabilities to form connections with other people. Can we drop the addiction claim, or is that central to
No, I think it's like almost about how you define addiction, right? If you engage in a behavior to the point where it harms other aspects of your life, I think you can call that an addiction. If you'd prefer not to call that an addiction, then that's totally fine. I think central to the mechanism of harm here is overuse, right? And so I think it's unlikely that someone would have a one-off interaction with an AI companion that leads them down a course of action that has harmful consequences. I think that's unlikely, right? Like the AI told me to, hurt someone or myself, and so I did it. I think the likely kind of mechanism of harm here is you're spending hours and hours with this, neglecting other types of human relationships, getting worse at engaging in those human relationships, and that's how you end up being harmed. I totally agree, by the way, on the distinction between children and adults. I think I worry actually that this case is going to put a lot of emphasis on protecting children. And if the kinds of worries that I have bear out, we might miss the mark on protecting, say, the elderly. I think that's another kind of obvious vulnerable population. I totally agree about drawing that distinction.
Actually, the elderly is another interesting kind of case, because suppose they're in a nursing home. There's not a lot of opportunities for social interactions with new people. It's the same people on your floor or whatever. You don't get around a lot. And you don't have a lot of opportunities for meeting new people and forming meaningful relationships. And for them, I actually think if their capacity to form deep, meaningful relationships with other people withers while they have this meaningful interaction with the chatbot, I don't know. Do I think this? I'm just going to say, I'm not sure that I endorse this, but I'll float it. Who cares? If it's a kid, you've got in mind something about what his or her future looks like, where you want to make sure they have these kinds of abilities to interact with other people because you want them to have lifelong friendships. You want them perhaps to be married, to have children, to have blah, 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 to have all that. But if this person's 85, forget it. They don't.
We moved from Kant to Bentham, it seems, right?
Well, I thought Kant was wrong. I was just clear.
Yeah, look, is there a utilitarian argument to be made here? Sure, but you can come up with other kind of, I think, dark utilitarian arguments about how we ought to treat old people.
Yours is a utilitarian argument, or to put it differently, yours is an argument about good consequences. Because your point is, if children engage in these kinds of relationships with chatbots, it will cause them to be in a state such that they can't form meaningful human relationships, where among the things that you want to, if not maximize, at least increase, is meaningful human relationships. So if you had said something like, it's intrinsically, there's something about giving, as it were, your love to a chatbot that is contrary to human nature, or it's fundamentally self-deceptive, which is, let's say, intrinsically wrong, or something like that would be a non-consequentialist argument. But yours is as far as I can see, yours is a thoroughly consequentialist argument.
I think it makes sense in many cases to ground this in kind of the consequences. But I think, as I said at the beginning, it's grounding the consequences on the individual. And moving away from children, I think the key group that we might worry about is our young, lonely men who are looking for kind of a sexual outlet, who end up withdrawing, that kind of thing. For the elderly, I think I agree with you that it's a different argument that probably centers on human dignity. And in the same sort of way that I would feel uncomfortable if we medicated the elderly so that they could live out, in quotation marks, their life in some sort of drug-induced fantasy, this feels contrary to human dignity, right? For that population.
Well, yeah. If we, against their will or without consulting them, did such a thing, that would be morally objectionable for sure. But if they said, you know what, I'm 85, had a good life, et cetera, done here, I'm going to do some drugs. And now I say this as someone who has never done any drugs at all, zero medical drugs, but I don't even drink alcohol. So I'm not I'm not a hedonist by any stretch of the imagination. I'm totally bored in that respect. But if they say, look, I'm just going to get, I don't know, high out of my skull for the last few years that I've got left because I got nothing left to do in the nursing home. I don't know. I actually think, all right, live and let live. That's how you want to end it. Go ahead.
I think that there is like an element of consent to this. And now this becomes very substantial. But I think one of the key failings of the European AI Act is that there isn't really a consent framework, right? So the prohibitions they have there are absolute prohibitions, and there's no mechanism by which you can consent to them. So I'm not arguing that like we should have a blanket ban on AI companions or anything like that.
Sure.
I think really it's about trying to align the incentives of the developers of this technology with the incentives of their users. I think that's all it really is. And so if there are people who, either because they have nothing else going on in their lives and they might as well just spend their time on this, or people who are able to maintain like healthy human relationships while still spending lots of time talking to AI, and it helps them, makes them feel happy. Like that's totally fine. Right. What I want to avoid is technology that's designed in a way to captivate an audience that doesn't really want to be captivated or that is harmed by being captivated. And so it's the worry about the kind of dark patterns of AI companionship.
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting. I was going to let the addiction conversation slide a bit because it's not really core, but I'm beginning to think that it actually is a little bit core, or at least the way that we think about what constitutes addiction is core to this discussion. Because I want to say things like the following. I think that a crucial part to addiction is that there's something that it does to subvert the will of the person who's addicted, to subvert the will so that despite themselves, they find themselves drawn to such and such. I'm addicted to Doritos or something like that on the condition that I say, I'm not going to have any more Doritos. I'm done with the Doritos. I've had 3 bags already. It's time to put them down. And then I just find myself opening another bag. There's something to do. Same thing with cigarettes. I don't want to be smoking. I'm done. Or at least it's you're addicted if your will is subverted, or it would be subverted were you to change your will or something like that. So I smoke a pack a day and I'm cool with that, but I'm addicted because if I decided to stop, I would still find myself irrationally pulled towards the thing. So anyway, I think that talk about the will is essential to talking about addiction. And your way of talking about addiction, I think, is different because it's a matter of whether the thing harms the person. And I don't think that the fact that it harms someone is necessarily a case of addiction. If they're cool with, is this what I want to say? If they're okay with that harm, they think that the harm is not that bad. They think the juice is worth the squeeze. Yeah, maybe I'm gonna get lung cancer when I'm 90, but I don't care. It's worth it. Maybe that's ill-advised or stupid, but it's not, my will is not subverted or something along those lines.
I think we should limit the time spent arguing about definitions, right? So like the way I understand that lots of people define addiction is that it's engagement in a behavior that becomes compulsive or persistent and is continued despite harmful consequences, which means that if I'm a smoker and I say, look, I know all about the lung cancer, I just don't care, I want to keep smoking, I'm still addicted to cigarettes, right? Even though I have zero will to stop smoking cigarettes. But I think it's semantics, right? However, here it might actually matter because it's not that everybody who uses this is good, right? So there's a way to use this technology that is not harmful, and there is a way to
Mhm.
use it that I think might be harmful. And it's not like there's a safe way to smoke cigarettes. And so I think finding that line, and that line has everything to do with that person's mental state of mind, place in life, how things are going, how vulnerable they are to companionship and being, I think, seduced by the way that these companions act and behave. I think it's hard to divorce this from exploring the state of mind of the user and figuring out if the premise is this can help some people, or at least it's completely harmless for some people and maybe has some benefits, but for others it's harmful, then we need to figure out where is that line. And in what I've written about the topic, I think one of the key takeaways, which I realize is really unsatisfying, including for myself, but is like we need to do more research, right? We don't understand what drives people
Mhm.
in this kind of context. And so if we want to have sensible regulation, and I worry very much about nonsensible regulation,
Sure.
if we want sensible laws in this space, we need to actually have a deeper understanding of the psychology and under what circumstances does this result in harm.
Y- Yes. So let me say a few things. Number one, I'm happy to concede to your conception of addiction for the sake of argument. I don't think it's a semantic issue. I don't think we're arguing about the definitions of words. I think we're arguing about how do you accurately capture what constitutes addiction. So if you say what is addiction, I'd say it's more in philosophical parlance would say it's a metaphysical question. I think questions about addiction integrate with questions about the nature of free will and autonomy, and those are straight up philosophical issues, not semantic issues. But anyway, I'll take your mm, I'll take your definition of addiction, or your conception of addiction rather, which is something like something is addictive if you persistently engage in behavior that is knowingly harmful to you, something like that. Yeah.
Yes.
And then I take it that the bit about dignity, the way that dignity gets into your argument, and tell me if I've got this wrong. This is sort of me trying to reconstruct the argument. The way in which dignity gets into the picture is that if the designers have built something that causes someone to persistently engage in behavior that is knowingly harmful to them, then that is an affront to human dignity. The developers of the AI, of the chatbot, have violated a principle to respect human dignity. Is that a fair, I don't know, framing of your argument?
So I'm inclined to say yes, but with a caveat where when I was talking about dignity earlier, we're talking about the elderly and the idea of them spending their last years on Earth speaking to AI. And I have this kind of visceral sense that there's something, I don't know, contrary to human dignity about that. Not dissimilar from having someone hooked up to virtual reality.
I was going to make that
Yeah.
comparison. Yep.
And so, and then you brought up the point, which I think is fair, that if someone chooses to be in that state, then frankly, why not, why value my abstract notion of dignity over autonomy? And I'm with you, right? And so then the issue is like, you want people to be making that choice in an independent kind of way. And so where I think we circle back to what you just said is in the case where we're taking harms off the table, right? Because like in the elderly case, it's not about you will stop engaging with other people and become the worst member of society. It's just about you and your state of mind. Then I guess the dark patterns are a question of dignity. I think in most cases, so to take the young man who's had a lot of trouble finding a partner, who feels very lonely, unsatisfied with his job, turns to AI, ends up spending hours and hours on it. I think there's a dignity piece there, but there's also broader harms to that person, harms to society and the community at large. And I worry less about the dignity piece of how he ended up in that situation. And I don't think it's problematic just because to have dark patterns in this kind of context, just because it undermines human dignity. I think that's a piece too, but because of the downstream effects, which we had taken off the table when we were talking about the elderly earlier.
So I think that you might have three separate arguments going on, which
They're definitely
each compatible.
multiple. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's not meant as a criticism in any way. That's just to say that I feel like I'm picking up on a different thread now, because there was first the issue of it's going to cause people to not be able to engage in meaningful human relationships, where there's some kind of background, extremely reasonable assumption that meaningful human relationships are a core constituent of a life worth living, something along those lines, or a good life, something like that. So I think that's one issue. And then so we get into this empirical inquiry is needed for whether that's the claim. And actually, you have your more general claim is something like, there could be all sorts of harms that this causes, but it's at least in part an empirical question. So that's your call for more research. We need to research and investigate what other kinds of harms other than undermining of relationship capacities might these kinds of quasi-relationships cause. So that's one strain of this. There's another strain of it, which has to do with, I think, and this is me recapitulating a little bit what I said earlier, another strain or another strand of the argument, of a different argument against these things is something like, it's an affront to human dignity, and it's an affront to human dignity, I think, because the people can make these things. It's not chatbots as such. It's chatbots that are made in such a way that they manifest what gets called dark patterns. That is to say, behaving in ways that subvert, I'm going to put it in my language now, subvert the will of the person engaging with it in such a way that harm is caused. And so it's an affront to human dignity to treat people in this kind of underhanded manner. There's something underhanded about the treatment. So that's another argument against it, at least for some developers. And I take it up for debate whether Character AI, the makers of the chatbot that interacted with the teenager who committed suicide, whether they engaged in dark patterns or whether they had their chatbots engage in dark patterns. But the third thing, now to finally get to it, your third, I think, distinct argument is something different that comes up in the case of the elderly, which is something I'm inclined to myself, which is the experience machine argument. So Nozick, you probably know this, Nozick, but the audience might not. So Nozick has the famous argument where, actually, I'm going to give a revised version of it. Nozick's version is, you can go into an experience machine and have any sort of dream state you want for the rest of your life. Would you put yourself in it? I actually like to put the question slightly differently and say, suppose you have a kid. I come and knock on your door. I say, congratulations. What a beautiful boy. I've got this machine. You can hook up your kid to the machine. They'll sit in a chair for the entirety of their biological lives and they'll get nutrients. But they're going to, as it were, dream a life in which they get raised and they have relationships and marriage and kids and they win the Nobel Prize and they cure cancer and blah, 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 blah. Would you put your kid into that machine? And I think the reaction is meant to be one of repugnance. No, I would never no, of course not. My kid should live their lives. And that's because it's not just having certain kinds of experiences that make a life worth living, but those experiences have to, in some ways, be responsive to reality. It has to be actual accomplishments, not the dream of an accomplishment that makes a life worth living. So it seems to me like this third argument of yours that I think you made a reference to is something like, you could engage in these relationships with chatbots, and it's going to feel like a meaningful relationship, but it's not meaningful because in some deep sense, it's not real because it's a chatbot that doesn't have understanding. It doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't have sentience. It doesn't feel anything towards you. And so the relationship is not a relationship. It's a one-way street. It's bullshit. And so it can't actually provide meaning or value to a life. Okay, I'll stop. How does that sound
I think that's super well said. I agree. I do think that I agree with all three. This makes for a bad podcast response because I agree with you.
It's not me. This is just me. You should agree with it because I take it to be, I'm just pulling out, I'm not even giving my position. I'm just pulling out what I take you've been saying all along. I'm just trying to do the arguably annoying philosopher's thing, which is to dice them up and make sure that we have good order among the arguments.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, look, with regards to the last one, I am inclined to it, but I don't think I would want to, now if you take the conversation over to something like talk about regulations, which you've intimated at too? I don't know how to use that word now. Intimated to? Do you even know?
Hinted at?
Do you know?
I don't know.
Hinted at? Anyway, doesn't matter. Some kinds of harms you want to regulate against. And I know that you want certain kinds of regulations. And one thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to regulate against all the ethically bad stuff, because that would be an overstep, right? You can cheat on your spouse. That's morally bad. It's ethically bad. It shouldn't be against the law to do. You could lie to your best friend. That's ethically wrong. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think that there should be laws or regulations against lying to your best friend, though. When we keep these sort of three arguments in mind, we don't want companies engaging in dark patterns. We don't want people engaging in BS relationships that don't actually add value to their lives. And we don't want people to be caused to a variety of kinds of harms, including prominently the kind of harm that is a sort of psychological harm where you can't engage in real relationships with people anymore. among those three things, where do you think regulation ought to step
Yeah,
in?
I think overall, this is an area that's really tough to regulate, right? For exactly the reason that you outlined, that I think increasingly in our small L liberal society, we don't really want the government interfering in personal relationships. And I tend to agree with it, right? Like I'm not calling for us interfering with adultery or anything. And generally, I think it's going to be a challenging area to regulate. However, given the three things, so number one, AI companionship leads to some other harm, psychological or other. Two, a technology company designs its product to be highly engaging / addictive. And three, you're living in a fantasy world that is fundamentally meaningless and undermines your human dignity. I think that's also the kind of the order in which probability of regulation or appropriate regulation, like if someone wants to spend their lives in the dream machine or in the soft embrace of silicon companions, then that's totally fine, right? Or at least it's fine from like a regulatory point of view, as long as they're a consenting adult. I did have a thing in the piece I wrote about to what degree consent is meaningful here, given that these technologies are trained on kind of the collective wisdom of all of mankind. And is it really a asymmetrical relationship? And are we going to head into a future where essentially the AI can talk you into just about anything? And so the idea of going into this eyes wide open is really meaningless, but I don't think we're there yet. So I grant that the last thing is not an area where we want much legal interference. It seems like on the first point, where the AI companion causes you psychological harm, causes you to become withdrawn from society, that's the kind of thing where there are negative social externalities, feels like a kind of area where government action might be appropriate.
Hmm.
And we're seeing like the EU AI Act nodding toward this idea of AI inducing behavior that is harmful to individuals and things like that. So we're seeing a nod toward that. And similarly with the dark patterns and maximizing engagement, that seems like an area that people have been talking about, especially in the context of social media, where there ought to be more regulation. I think it's just tricky to figure out how exactly would that regulation look like. Is it say a tax on engagement where, after the 2-hour mark has passed, any additional hour the company has with you is less profitable or something like that? I don't know. I think it's actually tricky in practice. All of this is tricky. I hope that was a structured response.
There's two things to say. One thing is what I said earlier, which is that I'm just not sure how much, and background, I'm not anti-regulation, I'm not anti-law, I'm not on the right wing by any stretch of the imagination. Definitely not a libertarian, absolutely not. But I want to make sure that we're not regulating against, I think people should be more or less free to engage in activity that is harmful to them. I think lots of stuff that people do is harmful to them, and we shouldn't regulate against it. And so I think about, I don't know, snack food in particular. I eat way too many snacks, but I don't think that there should be any regulations by the government against it. I guess there are regulations and laws around nutrition labels. So actually that is a good regulation, so that I can look to see how many calories does this thing actually have? How much saturated fat does it actually have? And I'm enabled to make better decisions. So maybe I think that if we're thinking about regulations for this kind of thing, the rough equivalent of a nutrition label could be appropriate. I don't know. That's always just off the cuff. But I'm trying to get to the point where I think that there ought to be regulations, because I don't think it can be the case that we regulate against having the technology or having chatbots. I don't think that would be a reasonable thing. And then the question is what kinds of things. By the way, one of the things that Character AI says, right? There was some kind of warning on it, right?
Yeah,
Like
but it's super small, like physically small.
okay,
And the other thing that's
yeah,
interesting is if you interact with the character. So it would say at the bottom of it's a chat window, right? And so you see the incoming
mm,
chats, and at the bottom that this isn't a real person or something to that effect. But the
right, right,
actual
right, right,
companion will very happily reassure you that they're a real person.
yeah,
And so this is where I think a disclosure regime seems sensible, and requiring that to the best extent possible, right? Because these are stochastic models and we get into the actual technology here. It's hard to make guarantees, but like you
sure,
try to disengage when topics of self-harm come up and or refer people to expert advice. Seems like a reasonable requirement. You make
yeah.
sure that the companion doesn't portray themselves as a real person, or at least when asked explicitly, they tell you that they're an AI, something like that. There's like the very American approach to all of this. We talked about the European AI Act very briefly. The American approach to this is like a product liability regime, right? You can put out whatever product you want, but if someone comes to harm and it's caused by your product, and causation is going to be the sticking point in all of this,
Yeah.
then you're on the hook. And that's the end of it, right? And so then we have 1,000 flowers bloom and lots of innovation, and that's great. But companies are incentivized to try to take steps to keep their users safe.
Yeah, I am. So there's two things I want to say. One is, and this is picking up a thread that I dropped earlier, which is something that you said, which is something like the extent of the harm is such that we're talking about not just individuals being harmed, but we're talking about societal harm.
Mhm.
So it's something like if the set of lonely males is getting harmed, that's a big hit to society at large. So we're not just talking about, if you like, individual rights, but societal harms. And you said something like, and that's the kind of thing that I could see government regulations being, that's an area where I could see government regulations being justified. This is just me highlighting that point. I think that's an important point that you made to highlight. And in some cases, we're not defying the rights of, and we're not doing everything that we're doing in an effort to protect the rights of individuals or the individual dignity of peoples, but some very general views about avoiding the nightmares of society. That seems like a fine place to at least have a discussion about what regulations might be appropriate. So that's just a sort of one point I wanted to highlight. The other point that I wanted to highlight, and we're getting at this, there's one question about regulations, but there's also just a question about moral obligations. And I think plausibly Character.ai or any such developer or company has a moral obligation to report, especially at least at a bare minimum for minors, has a moral obligation to report those conversations to, I don't know, I imagine it's parents or something along those lines. It has to be that when a kid signs up for this sort of thing, parents have to give consent. They have to sign up for the account. They have to verify, must be 18-year-olds or older to make an account or whatever. And maybe it's the kid's account, but the parent should be given abilities to, one question is whether the parent should have an opportunity or feel like a legal right to oversee such things. And then whether they have a legal right to be notified if things are going in the self-harm, suicide direction.
In a way, the context of children and of self-harm and suicide, that's like the easy cases in terms of thinking up plausible interventions. What I think is the hard case is, imagine 15% of lonely men become withdrawn and just less productive, less social, less happy members of society. There's a cost, right? There's a massive social cost that's associated with depression, and maybe they start eating poorly and like all of these other things like externalities, which makes me think, okay, this is an area where we ought to have government intervention insofar as like the government is there to solve these kind of market failures. And this could be a market failure where someone is willing to pay for something that harms them and has negative social externalities. It's just really challenging to think of what is the appropriate level of intervention, because I'm not arguing that we should have a blanket ban. I'm arguing for something along the lines of, so I explore that a little bit in the op-ed in the MIT Tech Review, where there's this idea of legal dynamism, right? Laws are usually static, but you could imagine that the optimal law depends on all sorts of external factors. Think the speed limit depends on how many other cars are on the road, how sleepy you are, what the weather is, right? But if we had changing speed limits, like that would be terrible for humans. For algorithms, that's actually plausible, that essentially the level of safeguards is a function of some external variables. And so maybe there is a way to get an AI companion that kind of unlocks new features based on inferred characteristics about the user over time. Like, I think technically that's feasible. What is trickier is to, like, one, what should those safeguards be to avoid this negative social externalities? And two, how do we create kind of legitimate regulatory incentives that urge developers to develop in that direction? Yeah.
Let me try to paint this picture a little bit more. You're talking about a kind of a dynamic product that's constantly changing in response to its user. So let's articulate what the ideal world looks like, and then see whether regulations are any help in getting to that ideal world or whether they're appropriate. I think the ideal world that you're talking about is one in which is something like these companions will engage in the relationship up to the point roughly at which it knows, quote unquote, knows that this is getting to be unhealthy for the user. Maybe the amount of hours that they'll spend with the person. Okay, I can talk with them another hour because they seem chill. Like they didn't talk to me at all last week. Now they want to talk extra long. That's fine. It's been a while. You do that for one person. Sexual relationships or intimate conversations or whatever you want to call them. Again, it might be dynamic. You're 13. Forget it. We're not having this conversation. You're 45. No problem. You're 45, but this is hour 8. This is ridiculous. I'm cutting you off. So I take it would it be that? Is that the ideal world where it's personal It's personalized guardrails.
Yeah, something along those lines. And what the details of those are, I'm not sure. I think time
Yeah.
seems like a very obvious one. Level of like sexually explicit material seems like another obvious one. What's
Yes.
like a little bit less obvious is like, seductive capacity. But I'm sure that this is going to be something that we can start
Uh-huh.
quantifying, right? Like sets of dialogue that are more likely to get someone in your group based on whatever statistical pattern the model inevitably will know about you to spend more time on, and dialing that up and down to make sure that, again, I think time is the key one. There are probably other markers. And yeah, I don't know. You can take this concept pretty far, I think, in terms of a harm mitigation strategy. It's nice because it leads to maximum utility per person, right? Because the idea, assuming that we can do all the modeling correctly, it means that you get to unlock all of the capacity of the AI that doesn't lead to negative personal consequences for you. And so everybody
Right.
gets the maximum. It's nice from like an economic surplus perspective. I think what it boils down to is how would you create incentives for this?
Right. Obviously, there could just be market driven. The incentives are you're going to get the right chatbot for you. It's ultra personalized, and it's not going to. We made it so that it doesn't become cigarettes that aren't cancerous for you. That's and then I don't know. I'm not a regulator, and I don't write regulation, so I don't know what a regulation would look like.
Yeah.
I take it to be something like it could be something broad. Certain kinds of precautions have to be taken in order to protect people, and then I take it if it were like it's got to be more specific than that, but in order to from a product liability perspective, you can tweak your product to have those kinds of guardrails. And the incentive is more features means more engagement. Let fewer features available to a given person means less risk.
Yeah.
So
The question is this me saying you should make cigarettes that don't cause cancer, in which case everyone will want them? Or am I saying you should make alcohol that doesn't get you drunk, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? And is this something that users want? And I suspect that we've seen, so character has gone through a couple of stages where they've become more restrictive. And in my personal opinion, like using the platform, I think they still have very little in terms of safeguards compared to, say, an OpenAI. But they have become more restrictive, and users have reacted very negatively to the restrictions that have been placed. So I expect that this isn't something that people are excited about. And there is an element of paternalism that's hard to get away
yes.
from. So yeah, I don't know if this would be a popular type of intervention. In my view, it walks the line, though, because it seems like we get some harm prevention while also minimizing kind of the disruption to users. And if you design this well, hopefully the idea would be that it would be pretty responsive, right? So you could get the features that you want pretty quickly, conditional on you demonstrating that you're not going to be harmed by them. And the question is like, how many interactions will that take? Is it a month-long onboarding process, a year-long, a week-long, a day-long? I'm not sure.
So Robert, so what do you think are the big sort of the takeaways here that with regards to harm or regulation? What should we walk away with?
Look, this is an area that has developed incredibly quickly, right? 3 years ago, this podcast would have been complete theory. And now we're talking about real cases. And presumably, the development is going to continue to be really rapid. And we know very little about how these kind of technologies and media interact with humans. And in my view, there's just not that much to lose by taking this very seriously. Worst case, we'll do a bunch of science and we'll learn something about human-computer interaction. And best case, we can prevent scenarios that I think might be really dystopian. I don't know. I have this sense that there are a large number of people that could be extremely vulnerable to well-designed AI companions, and we're already seeing kind of initial signals. So yeah, I think the main takeaway for me is this ought to be something we take seriously. And it's going to be tricky because the research and academic community is one that's extremely disciplinary. And people don't do well about bridging across these disciplinary gaps. And so this is clearly something where we need kind of economists and psychologists and technologists and regulators and lawyers to work together. And it feels quite important to get our act together, not just, by the way, for the AI companionship, AI addiction piece, but for lots of the other types of pro-social applications of AI, where this type of interdisciplinary study is going to be really.
I actually want to push your point a little bit harder than you. One, you're calling for a certain kind of epistemic humility. We just don't know what's going to happen. We don't know the scale of this, but there's reason to suspect it'll be quite large. We don't know the exact harms, but there's some ideas about, and we don't know how severe those harms will be. And given what's at stake, we should really take this AI companion harms seriously. I actually think you could say that there is some evidence in some sense that here's another argument for taking it seriously. We wouldn't have thought that Instagram would cause depression among teenage girls or something along those lines. If I had said, what if there were an app where you just post pictures of stuff? You'd be like, yeah, cool. And I said, we should take these online social media harms really seriously. You'd have been like, it's someone, you could imagine someone saying, come on, it's pictures. People posting pictures. What? And then it turns out, okay, there's legit research showing depression among teenage girls is increased by their time on Instagram, et cetera, because of the kinds of pictures. And then we've seen this with social media more generally, not only depression and anxiety, but also things like disinformation. Extremely well documented risks, harms have been discovered with social media, ones that many people wouldn't have predicted, even if the question had been raised back then, which people didn't really talk too much about in general. So it seems to me like we also have a history of not taking technological harms seriously. And then when we do, it's arguably too late, or now we're behind the ball, and this is an argument for not being behind the ball.
I totally agree. I think we have simultaneously a history of not taking the harm seriously and of fear-mongering. Like,
Right.
You can find articles about how TV, and then you can find books about how newsprint is going to cause the dumbing down of the masses and all these things. So there's a lot of fear-mongering. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to kick off intellectual inquiry. And like I said, I think that the consequences of not taking this seriously could be really large, whereas the cost of doing it is not actually that big, right? Like, we're calling for just scientific research and taking something seriously.
Yeah, so much. I think that's a super interesting topic. And you'll come back on when you've done some more research and you've discovered all the harms.
Perfect. Would love to.
All right, thanks again, Robert. This was great.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.